you've ever launched, you know it's one of the most scary moments, no matter how experienced you may be in producing content, right?
Oh, yeah. And every time you think, should I share that audio? What will people think? Do I even know how to distribute a podcast? What is an RSS feed? All those questions, among others, make it really, really challenging for new podcasters who we want to hear from launching their own podcasts. But today we have another opportunity for you to learn how to launch your podcast successfully and, more importantly, fearlessly. Akua Nyame Mensah is a amazing coach and new podcaster who launched a podcast and has created many, many opportunities for professionals across West Africa and the whole of Africa as a whole to create incredible content, to be fully present wherever they are, and to feel that launching a podcast is not scary at all.
And even if you still feel scared, do it anyway, because it's one of the most exhilarating things you can do. Starting is the hardest part. So, Akua, welcome to Africa Podcast Day. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. And thank you for saying my name in that way. I love it. So I'm really excited to share the content that I have here. I'm someone who does notes. So when I'm doing a podcast, I typically have a lot of notes around me. So if you see me looking down, I'm just checking in to make sure that I'm on the right track. To get started, maybe I should introduce myself. And I typically spell out my name. So it's Akua. I respond to Akua. I also respond to Akua and Akua. And so I am a certified executive and leadership coach. I'm also a facilitator and a speaker. And even though I do so many things where I put myself out there, where I am talking, starting a podcast was incredibly scary. And just to give you a little bit of a backstory, I never thought I actually would start a podcast. It was until someone actually said that, hey, you're such a great speaker, you should consider putting yourself out there on a podcast. And I very much was like, nope, I'm not doing it. And so what I wanted to share today was just some of the thoughts that went through my head. And my hope is that it's helpful to you. And in addition to that, please feel free to join me by jumping into the comments. I love hosting very engaging conversations. And so I want to make sure that you make the most out of this conversation as well. So feel free to jump in the comments, to add your thoughts, and I will make sure that I share them even before we get into the Q&A section. So if you had a chance to take a look at my workshop description, and I have it here, I wrote, it's scary to put yourself out there. And I think that the first step in being able to do anything that's new or that's different is to be able to admit to yourself that, hey, it might be a bit scary. You might be feeling a little fearful. There might be a bit of anxiety. And in my opinion, that's actual true freedom. The freedom to express your emotions, the freedom to figure out how to regulate those emotions and how to work through them and think about what is that next best step. And so it's scary to do that. And I think for me, that was really the first step that I had to take and I had to admit to myself. And so that's really what helped me think about what I wanted to do next. So I think the first thing that we all should do, especially when it comes to thinking about putting yourself out there in this way that seems somewhat permanent, is normalizing that doing something different, wanting to make a difference, wanting to share your perspective is a scary thing. And so as a coach, I am constantly reflecting on how I'm showing up, the behaviors I'm having, and really trying to be intentional about the thoughts that I have. But when it came to doing my podcast and putting it together, it was incredibly difficult. And even now, when I'm putting out an episode and I'm about 30 episodes or so in, I still have some of those thoughts. I still go back to those thought loops around what will people think? Will people think of me in a different way? Will this sort of reduce potentially the amount of opportunities that I have moving forward? And so it's still something that I think about. And so what are some of the things that I told myself? And what is sort of the process I take myself through? And what are some of the resources that maybe I even leverage when it comes to doing something new and when it came to thinking about putting together my podcast? That's really what I wanted to share with all of you today. All right. So some of the things that I told myself. So the first one that I have on this list is that no one wants to hear my thoughts, which once again is incredibly hilarious because I do coach and facilitate and speak, right? But I told myself, well, no one really wants to hear my thoughts. Not enough people want to hear my thoughts. So why would I put together a podcast? And I think for so many people, there is very much an expectation, or their definition of success is somewhat related to the number of people who are listening to their podcast. And for some, that might be maybe where they want to focus. But what I decided was that with my podcast, I didn't want to focus on the numbers. I wanted to really focus on those who took the chance on me to listen and would get back to me and share their thoughts, or would get back to me and were interested in maybe working with me. The second thing that I have on here, and this is something that I have struggled with for my entire life, is that I talk way too fast to be a podcast host. And some of you listening to this might think that I still talk too fast. And so one of the things that I just had to get over was recognizing that, yep, I do have a bit of a fast-paced way of speaking, especially when I get passionate and really excited about the topic, and that's okay. And if everyone can't follow, I am more than happy to have people reach out and tell me that, hey, maybe you should consider slowing down. I'm okay with dealing with those comments now. And if you're listening to a podcast, the amazing thing is that it's recorded. You can slow it down on your end. You can repeat it. You can rewind. There are so many ways in which you can think about leveraging a podcast, right? You can also watch or listen to this, read the transcript as well. So really recognizing that some of these same things that came up when I decided to become a coach and speaker and facilitator are some of the same things that still came up for me, even though I had worked through them in a bit of a different way. The next thing I have on here was really more around the content. So I really started to get fearful and scared about the content that I'd put out there. And so the notes I have on that is my thoughts are way too out there and I will piss somebody off. And one of the things that I've had to just once again get comfortable with is recognizing that we each have our own version of reality. And this is something that I actually teach in my coaching. So I literally have to coach myself through this almost every single time I have my own podcast episode. So really recognizing that so many of us think that we're all alike or all the same or have the same thoughts or have the same beliefs or have the same values. But the reality is that none of us do. Each of us is an individual and we have no idea what's going on in people's minds. And so to take the time and energy or spend the time and energy to think about how other people are maybe interpreting our words or how we're coming across may not be the best way to spend all of your time. I think though, of course, if you're putting content out there, you want to make sure that it's having the intended impact, but you shouldn't get too caught up in maybe what someone on the fringes says or someone who maybe wouldn't be a good fit for your services if that's the reason why you have a podcast. So really just recognizing that listening to feedback is great. It's important, but we also need to be selective about what we decide to actually action and what we actually decide to implement and actually focus on. The other thing that I thought was really important to bring up as we had this conversation was this idea that it needed to be perfect. I think that because of the work that I do, especially because I specifically focus on supporting leaders and executives, there's this idea that I need to look a certain way. I need to sound a certain way. It needs to be perfect. I always need to sound like I know exactly what I'm saying. And once again, when I realized that this was one of the thoughts that was holding me back from being able to launch my podcast, I had to laugh at myself because all the work that I do as a coach and facilitator is to create that safe space for others so they can try on new ideas, try on new thoughts, think about things in a different way so they can get closer to their goals. And so if there's someone listening to my podcast that doesn't think I'm professional enough, or I don't sound like I'm someone who can support executives, or that, I'm a hypocrite because I changed my mind and I evolved because I'm a human. Once again, those are not the types of people that I actually want to engage with. They're welcome to listen to my content, but we're probably not going to get along. And I doubt they're going to reach out to me for a coaching opportunity or a facilitating opportunity. And once again, that's absolutely okay. And that I will not look stupid if I change my mind, because as a human being, we are constantly evolving. We're getting new information. And it's really important that we open ourselves up to trying on new ideas and thinking through things in a different way. And at the end of the day, that is the reason why I wanted to host my podcast and why my podcast is called The Open Door Conversations. The entire idea is to provide people the platform to share their perspectives. And I also share my perspectives as well, and sort of how I approach thinking through things and how I've supported people through thinking through things. And so if I myself am telling myself that, oh, I need to be perfect or I can't contradict myself, I am once again sort of going against this ethos that I wanted to create with this podcast. And so as I think through, and as I'm sharing some of these thoughts that came up for me when I was launching my podcast, you'll notice that all of these are mindset related. I didn't even get into talking about the software, right? Or the platforms I was going to use. And that's an entirely another thing. But with the work that I do, especially as I teach sort of leveraging social media, and I've also had the opportunity to sort of share how I've been able to build out my podcast with a lot of support, I will tell you, I always love to start with the mindset, because so many of us believe that the things that actually stop us from being successful are those tools, right? Are the resources. But it really starts in our head, and it really starts with the stories that we're telling ourselves, the thoughts that we have, and the feelings that we have towards things. And so if we get really clear about what we think towards things, it's so much easier for us to do the other part. And the other part is thinking about the tools and the technology and trying to figure out all those elements. And so as I had the opportunity to reflect on putting together this podcast or this workshop, however you want to define it, I sort of felt like it fit into this sort of 3-step process that I take my clients through and that I try to take myself through when I recognize that I'm anxious or fearful towards things. And so that 3-step process really starts with building my awareness. And as I've talked through some of these thoughts that I had and the things that came up for me when I was going to launch my podcast, I think that that's something that very much relates to this idea of the importance of building your self-awareness and recognizing that there are other things going on that might make it difficult for you to show up and even record a podcast, right? And so once you're clear, right, you have that self-awareness, right? You've gotten clear on some of those things in your head that might get in your way. The next step is starting to think about what is your strategy, right? If you want to launch this podcast or you want to do this other thing that you feel is somewhat scary, why? Why is it so important for you to do this? And what is it in relation to some of your bigger goals that you have for yourself? And for me, even though I was terrified to do this, and I had several people in sort of the coaching coursework space who were like, oh, you'd be so good at this. And I was like, nope, I can't do this. Like for all those reasons, right? All those mindset things that I shared, I realized that actually this might be a really great strategy to share my thoughts with people who potentially might want to work with me. And even if they don't want to work with me, it's still a really great way to share ideas, approaches, and resources with people that might want this type of support. And when I started my coaching consulting practice, it really was to create the type of support I wish I had when I first started as a leader. And so it very much fit into this vision or this idea or my mission that I have for this business that I've created over the last, it's almost 4 years now. It's pretty crazy to think. And so getting really clear on that and getting really clear on some of those thought pieces that might be getting in your way is so key to being able to launch your podcast. And I actually would recommend that you actually start there rather than thinking about the technology or the tools. And so for me, what I got clear on was 1, okay, I think this is something I can do, but I think I need help with this. Number 2, I also was very clear with myself on what I wanted to use my podcast for. And I know a lot of you on here might be using your podcast for different reasons. And so this actually might be a great opportunity to just reach out into the ethos. And those of you who are listening to this, to just ask, why did you start your podcast? Let me know in the comments. And I have the comments up, so you can feel free to type in the comments. And so I can see those going through. But why did you start your podcast? For me, it very much was a business decision. And I know for some people listening to this, they might be like, well, why would that be something that you use for your business? And that's simply just because as a coaching consultant and someone who speaks, it's not incredibly scalable. And so I felt that, and through having conversations with people, I saw that a podcast would be a really great way to share the way in which I show up, the energy that I have, the way in which I think with lots of people. So really recognizing that, starting with that mindset piece and really thinking through why am I doing this can really give you that motivation to ask for help, right? And Laura, thank you so much for that. Asking for help is really hard. And I'm actually getting to that. I have that as one of my points on here with this sort of 3-step process that I go through. But the first step, right, to even get that courage to ask for help and even maybe recognize that you need help is getting really clear on what potentially could be stopping me, or having some element of recognizing that, hey, this is something that's potentially stopping me internally. And also getting very clear on why am I doing this and why is this important? Because all of those pieces are going to help to dictate what you might need and the support that you might need beyond you, right? So that's really that first step, getting really clear, building your self-awareness, maybe even writing down your why and thinking through what is potentially that strategy, right? That next step is really all about engaging. So what I have here in my notes is, how do I want to show up and why? What resources do I need to actually show up? And one of the things that I've learned about myself through building my self-awareness is that I can really show up when someone is depending on me. So recognizing, right, when you're thinking about your tools and resources, like what would be helpful for you to be able to get from point A to point B. And in this case, the point A is from being fearful about having a podcast to being confident about putting myself out there and maybe having some additional support, because I do have some resources. And in this case, I'm talking about financial resources that I can invest. For others, it might be time resources that they can invest in learning the tools and the technology so they can do it for themselves. But you really need to build your awareness and be clear on that why, and it be something that really does resonate with you for you to be able to, 1, invest financially, or even 2, invest with your time. So in terms of thinking about engaging, right, asking for help, which can be incredibly difficult, can be so helpful. And there are a lot of resources online. And so I started reading different things online. I took like a really short little mini course, which was meant to be a boot camp. And then I decided, because of how my business looks, that it made the most sense to actually invest in a podcast manager. So I have an amazing podcast manager. And as I mentioned before, because she's dependent on me and it's something that I'm paying for, it's a service that I pay for, every single week, you best believe I show up, I record that podcast, I work through those same fears that I shared with you earlier. And I also have the added benefit of having her expert opinion give me additional assistance and support in shaping the way in which my podcast looks. And for me, that's been incredibly helpful. For others, once again, if you don't feel like you have the financial resources for that, joining podcast groups. So the reason why I even heard about this opportunity was partially because I was part of a podcast group, right? And that's, once again, a really great way to get feedback, to get access to those resources, to get ideas on the tools and the techniques that you can even use, right? To be able to show up and have your podcast recorded and disseminated through whatever means you want to. But you really need to be clear on the fact and recognize the fact that you need that support and be open, right, to getting that support, whether it's direct or indirect. But just asking that question in that WhatsApp group can really help to spur some new ideas and really help you get closer to that goal of launching your podcast, if that's something that you want to do. And finally, when we are thinking about engaging and really thinking about, how to put yourself out there, being really clear on how much time and energy you want to put towards it can also be incredibly helpful. With the work that I do with my clients, we spend a lot of time talking about time and productivity. And for so many people, right, I've heard and had conversations with, they talk about how having a podcast takes a lot of time and energy potentially. And so being very clear and very honest with yourself around how much time you want to put towards it and how much time you think you can put towards it can really help you also think about what is that cadence for that podcast, right? Maybe it isn't weekly, right? And that's absolutely fine. So I put out my episodes weekly. I record them sometimes in batches, sometimes not. It depends on how much time and energy I have. but everyone does it in a bit of a different way. And so if you are starting off, I'd recommend that you reach out to a few people, that you use, right, this network, this even podcast day as an opportunity to learn about how other people do things and learn the different ways that you can do things. There is no one right way to do it, right? And when we go back to thinking about some of the thoughts that might get in the way of you being able to launch your podcast and be able to show up confidently, the thought that there's one right way to do a podcast, or you can only do a weekly podcast, or that you have to be good at batching your episodes to do a podcast can really, really get in your way and can really make it difficult for you to show up, because no two people think about how to do this, right? No two people do it in the same way. Everyone does it differently. And as I mentioned before, with this, because I was completely new to it, having an external resource, an external partner, right, that I invested in made it really easy, right? Meant that I made it a priority to get it done. So if that's something you can do, I would recommend it. And if not, once again, you can get an accountability partner, you can join WhatsApp groups, you can find a buddy within this network, I'm sure, that can be incredibly helpful as well. All right. The last thing I wanted to share here, then I'm excited to get into the comments, is really being clear on your expectations. And this is the third thing actually that I tend to teach with the work that I do with leaders and executives, is really recognizing that you need to set expectations for yourself and others. You're allowed to evolve. I recommend you evolve, right? It's really important that you're constantly updating it and iterating, but it's also important that you set expectations so you can define what success looks like for you. And so if you're using someone externally of you to support you, so for example, maybe you're getting an editor, it's very important that you set expectations around when is it going to be due, right? When are you going to give it to them to edit, right? The raw footage. When are they going to give the footage back to you? Even setting expectations with yourself around when do you want it posted? How often do you want it posted? Those are all things that you can make sure that you write down. If you're someone who likes to sort of create a contract with yourself, that's something that you can do, right, to help hold yourself accountable. And once again, if you're using people externally of you, that's also a really great way to make sure everyone's on the same page. And when you're thinking about setting expectations, I think a great question to ask yourself, and I mentioned this before, so expectations definitely goes hand in hand with building that self-awareness, is asking yourself, what does success look like to you? And as I mentioned earlier on, I was not really focused on building a massive audience. In terms of my numbers, I don't have millions and millions of people listening to my podcast, and I'm okay with it. I did not build my podcast for that particular use. Just like with my social media and how I approach it for building my business, I'm a lot more interested in making sure that a few people listen to it and are excited to work with me and are excited to invest in me. And so as I think about the amount that I've invested in it, and I know I'm going a little bit deep here, but just trying to give you an example of what this might look like if you're leveraging your podcast for a business, you know, the amount I invest in it, I am clear on the number of potential clients I would need as a speaker or as a coach to be able to cover it. And I was okay with that investment because I felt like that was something I was willing to do. And I know I'm going to be able to get back in other ways. So really just recognizing that as you set expectations, whether they're financial or whether they're related to the certain amount of exposure that you get, you should be very clear on the inputs that you have control over, right? I don't have control over the number of people who listen to my podcast. What I do have control over is the content that I share, right? How I share it and where I share it. And so making sure that if you do want a podcast that has millions of subscribers and millions of people listening to it, there is a specific approach you're going to have to take in order to get there. You're probably going to have to be on lots of other popular podcasts. You're probably going to have to share it in lots of different places. You're probably going to have to talk about certain topics that maybe appeal to a bigger audience. So just really thinking through what success looks like for you, and then working backwards to think about what are those specific steps you're going to take can be, once again, incredibly helpful. And also, once again, help you get that confidence and work through some of that fear or some of that anxiety that might come up when you're thinking about building your podcast and launching your podcast. The last note actually that I just wanted to share in terms of launching your podcast, with the podcast manager that I had, I felt just so comfortable because she had an entire process that she actually took me through. And once again, these are things that I'm sure you can find online if you Google, or once again, if you have conversations with other people who have been there and done that, and everyone will have a different approach. So the key, right, is to just ask yourself when you're launching your podcast, what would make you the most comfortable? what do you think would make the most sense maybe for the audience that you already have or the audience that you're looking to build? And using those pieces of information together to help you think about how you want to show up once again and what is the most sustainable way for you to show up. So that's all I think I wanted to share in terms of thinking about it from the perspective of the workshop or the specific thoughts and processes that you maybe want to walk yourself through or coach yourself through when it comes through launching your podcast. But really getting awareness and gaining awareness around those thoughts and that mindset piece is really key. Thinking about how you want to engage, right? And recognizing that there's no one right way to engage. But asking for help, putting yourself out there, reading, and just checking in, right? So then going back to that self-awareness piece to be like, okay, how do I feel about this? And then last but not least, making sure that you are setting expectations and checking in every so often to see if you're getting closer to those goals that you've set for yourself in relation to that podcast that you have. And once again, those goals might not be financial, right? They might be about the number of listeners and those sorts of pieces. But once again, you don't have control over the number of listeners. You just have control over how far and how often maybe you share it in certain groups. All right. So thank you so much for that. And what I wanted to do was just go into the comments. So we have Laura here. The fear is real. Launching a podcast is scary. Yes, it is. Thank you so much for that, Laura. And I'm curious, what are you planning to talk about on your podcast? And as you've written, right, it's scary to put yourself out there, and asking for help means that you actually have to get vulnerable. So recognizing that's something that might be challenging for you and thinking about how, right, can I make sure I'm able to ask this person? Is there a particular, maybe an introduction that someone can make, right, for somebody who could potentially support me? Is there a way I want to approach this that makes, sense for me and actually feels good? But asking for help, I think, is a key part in being a successful human and a successful leader. All right. Dr. Stephanie says, Hayden says, I haven't started one as yet. Thank you so much for that. I look forward to hearing more about what you would like to do maybe with the podcast, and maybe not, right? Maybe podcasting isn't for everyone, but going on other podcasts might be the way forward. So that's also something that you can learn about yourself. And I think that's absolutely fine. All right. This next comment that we have on here is from Laura. Yes, Laura, thank you so much. Defining what help you need, sourcing a team, and onboarding a team can take so much time, but it really does help. We've had to learn to ask for help after a long period of doing everything ourselves. Yeah. Right. So a lot of times we have this idea that we can do it, right? And we want to do it. And sometimes it is around, right? We don't maybe have this financial support. But one of the things I always love to share is that there's so many ways in which we can get people to support us where it doesn't necessarily have to be financial. So for example, maybe someone can support you, but you provide them a really great testimonial or feedback or referrals, right? So we can definitely think a little bit more creatively about how we can get that support. But it first starts with you making sure that you're clear on that you potentially have this mindset, because if you're stressed, if you're overwhelmed, if you're firefighting, it's really difficult to think clearly, and it's really difficult for you to think creatively. All right. All right. Next we have Jonah. Oh my gosh, I'm really bad. So please, Jonas Beck. I hope I said that correctly. Thanks for talking so openly about your doubts and fears. That's very helpful, and few people have the courage to do so. Thank you so much for that. And I'll actually even say, I actually have had some people reach out to me and say that because of the work I do supporting leaders, that I shouldn't talk about how I've had to re-record podcast episodes and that I need to be a certain expert that looks a certain way. As you can tell by the way in which I present myself, maybe even the hair I have, I feel very comfortable and confident, supporting leaders and founders who've raised millions of dollars the way I look, because I believe, and from what I've seen working with my clients, authenticity is key to being able to connect and key to being able to get those resources and connecting people. And so if you don't feel good about yourself, how do you expect to show up and support others? And so being able to say, hey, this is scary, but I'm willing to work through it and I'm willing to figure it out, I think is a key leadership skill that everyone needs to learn. Of course, it's context specific. So there's certain situations, maybe you wouldn't say it so bluntly, but I do think it's an important skill that every leader needs to learn. All right. Lillian says, thanks for such a practical session. Thank you so much for joining me. I've explored the do-it-yourself approach, but felt like it wasn't good enough to share. I love that you shared that. And I really would encourage you to put it out there because there's so many other things in my business that I did it myself and I continue to do it myself. I feel inspired after this session to go back to the drawing board to map out expectations, definition of success, et cetera, and face some of those fears and anxieties. Thank you so much for that, Lillian. And really recognize, right, that as human beings, we compare ourselves to each other, right? We do it so often, but we actually don't always have the back end, right? We don't always have a clear or full picture of what's happening. And so we'll see people put things out there and it maybe looks like they did it themselves, but they might have gotten help. And so I think it's absolutely fine to take a step back and maybe recognize that because you've decided to do it by yourself, and there's nothing wrong with that, that maybe you can only produce one episode every 2 weeks, or maybe that you only want to do things batched in a certain way. And I think that's absolutely fine. And there's nothing wrong with it. So really just recognizing that there's no one right way to do this. And there's a lot of tools and a lot of support out there if you want to do it yourself. So I think that's great, Lillian. And yes, please, please share your podcast when you get a chance, and please put it out there. Nosa says launching a podcast is one thing. Relaunching a podcast is a whole different ball game. I can imagine. I've never relaunched, so I don't know what's involved, but I can also imagine that it's very much along those same lines of working through what is that, what's that mindset piece? How do I actually want to show up? And then what are those expectations I want to set for myself and potentially others who might be able to support me? All right. Dr. Stephanie Hayden says, yes, hearing and seeing is different. I agree. Jacintia, I hope I'm saying that correctly. I have always had the fear of sharing my perceptions because of the unsafe media spaces for women. Vulnerability can be scary. I agree. And so I think the key here is figuring out where is that safe space for you. And because I do some work with leaders who also want to spend some time on social media in a sustainable way, in an efficient and effective way as part of their business, because they realize that social media can be really great for recruiting teams or getting on boards or fundraising, right? I also work with sometimes solo entrepreneurs and coaches who want to use social media maybe to get clients, and that's what I do. You have to decide what you're willing to share, and it has to make sense for you. And I always tell people, if you look at my social media, whether it's my LinkedIn or even whether it's my Instagram, and Instagram tends to be a little bit more personal, I don't actually share that much personal information. Even on my podcast, I do not share that much personal information. I will one-on-one with my coaching clients. I will in speaking engagements, but I don't really do that on my podcast. So you can decide for yourself where you're comfortable, and that range in which you're willing to talk about can also shift and change as well, right? So it can evolve. Maybe there's a point where you're willing to talk more, and then maybe there's a point where you're like, hey, actually, I've thought a bit about this, and I no longer want to do this, and that's actually okay. We evolve as human beings, and it's absolutely fine for you to be able to shift and change your mind depending on what makes the most sense for you. You can also think about, building a podcast in a bit of a different way. So for example, if you already have an existing community, maybe you only share that that content within a specific space, right? And I think that's absolutely fine as well. You can still consider it a podcast, right? You're still producing something over a certain period of time, but you're only sharing it with a certain group of people. And I think that's fine as well. All right, last comment that I see here is, Akua, your words are so encouraging and validating. Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you for sharing your insights, balancing your expectations and perfectionism, and being an artist who's sensitive about their work. Recipe for hoarding. Yes, I can totally feel that. I have to say, after we launched our children's storytelling podcast today, woo, that's amazing. Congratulations. It feels wonderful to just release and enjoy the ride. I love that, Laura. Thank you so much for sharing that, and congratulations. That's absolutely amazing. And I'm sure so many children are going to be just incredibly happy to be able to hear your stories and be able to experience that, right? So yeah, sometimes it's so scary when we start, but there are so many benefits that come from just putting yourself out there. And you really will be surprised at the people who will be touched based on what you're willing to share. So thank you so much for that. I think those are all the comments that I've seen in here. So thank you all so very much for taking the time to join me. I just wanted to check in with the Africa Podfest team. What's the next step? And I'm also going to take a break, little drink break.
Hey, Akua, that was an amazing session, and we are so glad to have you as one of our session hosts for this session. And also, I love what people are saying about you in the comment section. Thank you for the insights, very helpful. Launching a podcast is one thing, relaunching a podcast, a whole different ball game. That's Nosa. And then also Lillian Joro says, thanks for such a practical session. I've explored the DIY approach, but felt that it wasn't good enough to share. I feel inspired after this session to go back to the drawing board to map out expectations, definition of success, etc., and face some of those fears and anxieties. So I would ask you, Akua, please tell people where they can find your podcast.
Yeah. So you can find my podcast it is on Spotify. It's also on Apple Podcasts as well. So you just want to search for the Open Door Conversations, or even maybe just search my name. It might pop up with just searching my name as well. So you can find it on all podcast platforms.
Awesome. And then we have one last question for you, because we are always wanting to know, Akua, which country has the best jollof?
Oh no, you can't put me on the spot like that. All the jollof is good, just in different ways.
What better place to discuss this?
I love my mom's jollof. And my mom is actually African American. So her jollof is the best. And she used corned beef. It's great.